Much for joining us for the afternoon session. My name is Ursula Mindler and I'm very happy to chair the afternoon panel. I'm very happy to introduce my first speaker, Susanne Uslu-Pauer, whom I've known for years and whom I hold in great respect. She's a historian and archivist at the Jewish community of Vienna, and she also worked in various research projects, for example at the DÖF, the Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance in Vienna. Her research areas include post-war judiciary, prosecution of end war crimes, Nazi crimes against forced labors and against Roma and Sinti, and her book Vor dem Volksgericht, which is on post-war trials against Nazi perpetrators, won the Fred Sinowatz Science Award of the Austrian state of Burgenland. Today, Susanne is going to talk about the archive of the Jewish community of Vienna. The floor is yours.
Can you hear me? Yes, okay. So, first of all, let me thank you for the invitation to this very important conference, and I think it is very interesting in many fields. My subject area is the archive of the Jewish community of Vienna that is located only 5 minutes from here in a house next to the building of the Viennese Jewish community. The community is the umbrella organization of the archive, which is embedded as a new founded department in the structure and organization of the community since January 2009. I divided my lecture into 3 parts. I just want to tell you. The first one is about a short historical overview about the archive and the community and the Nazi control during the Nazi era. The second part, I will give you an overview about our widespread holdings, the re-establishment of the archive and selected archival holdings predominantly related to the Holocaust. And finally, in the third part, I will talk about existing and future projects. So the Viennese Jewish Archive is the only archive of a Jewish community known that have been maintained in its entirety from the founding of the community until the time after World War II. The archive was officially founded 1816 in 3 years. We have a 200-year anniversary. It was founded when the Council of Representatives of the Viennese Jews decided to establish an archive in order to gather regularly produced official documents like decrees, like documents, patents, or correspondence. However, it took another 30 years to become an institutional archive, and by the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century until the 1920s, the archive was professionally organized and the records were catalogued by subject terms and individual names. The last head of the archive before 1938 was Leopold Moses. At the time when Austria was annexed to the German Third Reich, Leopold Moses was very busy cataloging the entire archival holdings and creating a general index. This work was abruptly interrupted in March 1938. Immediately after the so-called Anschluss, the community was closed, and the National Socialists, respectively Adolf Eichmann, forced the IKG, this is a short abbreviation for the Israelitischen Kultusgemeinde, forced the IKG to relinquish its archive. In the beginning of May 1938, the community was reopened, and from one day to the other, you have to imagine the activities of the communities changed. The administration had to be completely rearranged because the Nazis fought the community to organize emigration, and in February 1941, when mass deportation started, the Jewish community was forced to participate in the deportation of the remaining Jewish population. The access to the archive was restricted. Only the last archivist, Leopold Moses, was allowed to use the genealogical registry and archival material for answering genealogical requests and inquiries from the Nazi authorities. In October 1943, Moses was imprisoned, and together with his wife, he was deported to Auschwitz in December 1943, where he died in 1944. His deportation is a symbol for the end of a once important archive that had become a scientific community or a scientific institution with the work of Sigmund Husserl, who managed the archive in the beginning of the 20th century. The Jewish community was totally under control of the Gestapo and the Central Office for Jewish Immigration, and respectively, Eichmann forced the Jewish community to make a release declaration in July 1938 concerning the archive. Furthermore, in the same year and 1 year later, extensive archival holdings and records from Jewish organizations and associations were seized by the protective squadron, the SS, and they were transported to Berlin to the Reichssicherheitshauptamt. It was the plan of the Nazis to unify the Viennese documents with other archival material from the Altreich and Nazi-occupied countries in a central archive for the so-called scientific NS research purposes. Because of the air raids in Berlin in summer 1943, the Nazi authorities decided to transfer the holding to Silesia, and they stored them in the hired repository at Schloss Wölfelsdorf. I will refer to this aspect of the transfer to Silesia later on. The Jewish community itself was dissolved by the end of October 1942, and the remaining community's duties were taken over by the so-called Ältestenrat der Juden in Wien, the Jewish Council of Elders, and this council had the legal status of an association, and the council existed until the end of the war. Let's get back to the archive. Due to the administrational reorganization by the Nazis within the community, as well as the confiscation of archival documents, and furthermore the closing of the archive, the entire records were no longer classified or sorted methodically. Additionally, the numerous produced records, card indexes, correspondence, and reports during the Nazi era were mixed up with material after 1945. The structure and order of the archive as it existed before 1938 had been completely destroyed. And moreover, due to the seizure of archival material by the Nazis and due to the very difficult post-war situation and period, the archival holdings of the community had been separated into several parts and are now widespread at different locations over the world, in Israel, in the Russian Federation, in Poland, and in other countries. Let me explain regarding our holdings in the Russian Federation and Poland. The seized documents and manuscripts in Silesia were discovered by the Red Army by the end of the war in 1945 and were transferred to Moscow. There are more than 2,500 folders and 66 Jewish manuscripts, as we know by now, that have been stored at the so-called Osobi archive, the special archive, at the Russian State Military Archive and the manuscript division of the Russian State Library. The documents, it's about correspondence, membership lists, reports, minutes, include archival records, manuscripts, and print of Jewish organizations and associations. It's their holdings from the Jewish community Vienna, from Graz, the Israelite Alliance, the sports club Hakoah, the Union Austrian Jews, the Israelite Theological Seminary, the Women's Zionist Organization, and the Union of Austrian Jews War Veterans. These are just a few examples of altogether 24 holdings claimed by the Jewish community, and we do this in close cooperation with the Foreign Ministry of Austria and the Austrian Embassy in Moscow. Apart from the location in Moscow, we know about 93 manuscripts that are preserved at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. And 2 weeks ago, there were negotiations, and we had the confirmation that we will get back the 93 manuscripts from Warsaw. The Jewish community has been taking all necessary steps to get back these documents in its entirety, and I want to be careful with any statement now. We are very confident that we will get a part of the archival material by the end of the year. So regarding the archive in Jerusalem, after the end of the Nazi terror, the newly established Jewish community faced an uncertain future. The officials had to overcome tremendous challenges to ensure the survival of a once very prosperous community, and it was thought to be impossible that a Jewish community could ever be re-established in Vienna after the war. You have to consider that the Jewish population had become very small due to Nazi persecution. About 120,000 Jews were forced into emigration. 48,000 had been deported, and altogether 65,000 Jews had been murdered by the National Socialists. Sorry. So by the end of 1945, or after the World War II, the archive itself did not exist anymore. The building were damaged, there were no appropriate storage facilities, and no manpower to rebuild the archive. So these are among others reasons why the chairmanship of the community agreed after long consideration to the transfer of archival records to Jerusalem as a loan. The community handed over 2/3 of its archival material from 1622 to 1945 to the Jewish Historical General Archives. Now it's called the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People in Jerusalem. 4 transfers took place in 1952, 1966, 1971, and 1978. In the 1970s, the former director, Dr. Avshalom Hodik, created an inventory, a finding aid, an inventory, and he shows, this inventory offers a very unique perspective about the internal and external affairs of the community, and even about the foundation of the Viennese community. There are documents from emigration deportation, from general administration, technical administration, from the committees, from the sections, a lot of paper and documents from the time period from the 17th century to 1945. For more than 2 decades, it was assumed that the entire archival records had been deposited at the Central Archives in Jerusalem. But during the inspection of a cellar of the main synagogue in the first district in 1986, numerous records, indices, and books were found by Ernst Meyer Stern. Among this material was the card index. You see it on the right side of the photo. There were the card index, a lot of paper. There were documents mixed up in a very bad condition, unordered, and so on. And among them also were the deportation lists. Also, the discovery of the material was very special, and the public also was informed by an article by Mr. Stern. The entire archival holdings were brought to a place that once more, as said clearly, remained untouched. The starting point for a revitalization of a Jewish community archive in Vienna was very unfavorable until the 1990s. There were no considerations to found a new archive, not even to investigate on the status of the refound material in 1986. But in 2000, the presidency of the community received an almost unbelievable telephone call. The records of the allegedly missing archive had been rediscovered in an old building of the community in the 15th district at the Herklotzgasse. The majority of the refound documents, there are about 800 boxes and numerous books, I'm sorry I have no photo from the storage room, were identified as dating from Nazi era, such as the migration, as I've already reported, Also books, maps, charts, brain books, material from before 1938, material related to marriage, death, birth. There were the birth announcement among the material, but also correspondence related to the time period 1950s to the 1970s. The importance of the archive became evident because of these documents. They show a very impressive insight of the archival holdings, and the rediscovery was a very big sensation. It was the starting point for further activities, especially the initial basis for the project Rebuilding the Archive as it existed before 1938. This time the archival holding was saved and transferred to the Jewish community. Due to the improper storage after 1945, the material was disordered, incomplete, scattered, deteriorated, crumbled, dirty, and besides, there were no inventories and no finding aids. A process of sorting and categorizing the material began, and records related to the National Socialists were separated from other holdings. Some material obviously suffered from the storage situation. They were actually falling apart, and so the main question was at this time how to secure the information and how to prevent the material from further falling apart. With the financial support of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the community was able to microfilm the Holocaust-related documents. In Vienna in 2002, and also in Jerusalem, they started the microfilming in 2003. At the moment, there are about 3 million pages microfilmed since 2002, 2003. Within the following years, the importance of the archive became evident, and in January 2009, the archive was founded as a new department of the Jewish community. The records discovered in Vienna and those deposited in Israel represent the worldwide largest preserved archive of a Jewish community and still in existence. Besides, they're the most extensive collection from the Nazi period. The most important documents are those dealing with social welfare, emigration, and deportation. I want to show you some examples of our holdings, beginning with the Emigration Index and related to the questioners. The most remarkable discovery was the Immigration Card Index. The index was produced by the Immigration Department of the community and contains the names of personal data of about 180,000 Jews. There are 3 card indexes. One is sorted numerically, one alphabetically, and one by profession. It is not known why exactly these cards or this index remained in Vienna. All 3 indexes are incomplete but correspond to the emigration questionnaires that are stored at Jerusalem. Each household could register his family in a detailed questionnaire, which conclude the applicant's name, the address, the birth date, profession, language, the financial status or circumstances, the monthly income, and also if there were relatives or friends abroad who could support the family trying to emigrate or to flee the Reich. Jewish parents could separately register their children for emigration at the Department for Children Emigration. Especially after the November pogrom 1938, Jewish parents who hesitated until then to register their children realized or got aware of the Nazi terror, and many of them registered their children for a Kindertransport. The Jewish community tried to select those children and orphans whose emigration seemed to be very urgent. And with the first transport from Vienna to England in December 1938, 700 children could be brought outside of Austria. As you can see at the end of the document, By the outbreak of the war in September, I hope you see it, I mean it's a little bit small, until the outbreak of the war in September 1939, more than 2,844 children were able to emigrate or were on the kinder transports to England, to United States, to France, to Netherlands, to Sweden, etc. Here you can also see the questionnaire of a child. This child was 9-year-old. She could escape and she survived. So this is the headache. Sorry. Sorry. Until the end of 1938, the number of Jews living in Vienna had been reduced from 165,000 to 118,000, and by mid-1939, there were only 72 Jewish people or Jewish persons left in Vienna. All those who could not flee the Reich until September 1939 had to be listed in a special register by order of Nazi authorities. And this register, I'm sorry for bad quality, this is from a microfilm, is ordered by district, street and building, and within the building it's alphabetically ordered by family and first names. So what a powerful tool such lists could be became apparent in 1941, when this and similar lists were used as basis for the deportation of more than 48,000 people. So this is one example of a deportation list. It's dated February 15, 1941 to Opole in the south of Lublin in Poland. The Jewish community Vienna, and from November 1942, the Council of Elders were provided with those lists, and they had to inform and to make sure that those people mentioned on the list arrive at the so-called assembly camps. In individual cases, the community was able to successfully request relief for those persons who were vital for maintaining operations. So there are a lot of documents. There are just a few examples I can show you today. But there are also card index of suicides and suicidal attempts, lists of those people who returned to Vienna, list of people who lived in Vienna in October 1946 and September 1945, death confirmation to Shanghai, list of people who emigrated to Shanghai, deportation confirmation from Prague. Records, charts, we have records and index from concerning compensation. There are also card indexes about the staff of the community during the NS era. The entire archival documents offer a huge variety, and the different methods, let's say, of researching and analyzing the Holocaust, of the fate of the Viennese Jewish population. The more intensive and extensive the documents are processed, catalogued, indexed, or researched, the more profound and substantial the information we can prepare for the public. So this leads me to the final chapter of the lecture, the existing project and future plans. So the most important project is the rebuilding of the archive. Almost 8 years ago, the community started to claim the return of archival documents from the archives in Russia, in Poland and in Israel. And the negotiations at the moment are on different levels. And as I told you at the beginning, we are confident to get them back by the end of the year. So the return of the archival holdings from all over the world is part of an overall plan an overall project. We want to establish an archive as it existed before 1938. It is the aim to concentrate the archive in its entirety on one location in Vienna, to accommodate the documents in one building, to store them properly, to catalog, to process, to index the holdings according to scientific standards, digitize and microfilm them and make them accessible to the public. So in Vienna there are about 7,500 archival boxes stored on 2 locations. And these are about more than, you have to imagine, 8 million pages and more than 2,500 running meter. The majority of the record has not yet been catalogued. So the archive files contain about 3 million documents and there are information about more than 120,000 Jews, including the children, regarding emigration, expulsion, and deportation. So the key activity for us, and the challenge for us as well, is not only to process the whole Holocaust-related files in a personalized manner, but also to record those documents from 1938 and before 1938 and after 1945. The most important preconditions are now to rebuild, to secure, to preserve and process the archival material in order to reinvigorate the archive, to make it vivid for the public and for the Austrian researchers and for the international researcher as well. The rising number of inquiries and users from all around the world, scientists, family researchers, students, private persons, there were about 1,500 requests in the last 4 years. They show that the interest in the archive is very intense. That's why we plan to make the archive accessible to the public. But in this context, the framework has to be created. We need an installation room. We need the installation of an appropriate user room. We need the technical equipment. We need the infrastructure for more than one person, because at the moment we only have space or the user place for one person. And in parallel, we want to manifest the legal framework, the archival law, fee regulation, user rules, and we're also planning to install a website. So for the time being, we are aware, the community and the archive is aware, that it is quite uncertain and not very transparent which kind of documents there are available and how they are accessible. We are aware of this situation. This will be changed with providing the public with a website including all necessary information, and this will particularly facilitate the first step of specific research. And we also want to be accessible to the public. Finally, we also want to establish a network with other Jewish archives and institutions, and of course, we want to continue with our existing projects, such as microfilming project with the USHMM, the digitizing project with the Wiener Wissenthal Institute, researching the provenance of our own holdings. This is the most important, I think, researching the historical background of the archive, processing the records after 1942. And we are also open for any further cooperation. By the way, we're also planning in the course of the next year the indexing of the list of the Kindertransport as a result of numerous requests in the last weeks and months. Finally, to sum up, the archival holdings of the Jewish community in Vienna witness the history of a formerly very vivid Jewish community. It is of big importance to preserve the entity of the holdings for the survivors of the Shoah and their descendants, researchers, historians, interested persons, family members from all over the world. Moreover, the Viennese archive is the centerpiece for past and future generation. It represents the unique and irreplaceable culture heritage, and it's our task to maintain the memory to all chapters of the history and to not only to Holocaust, but I emphasize to all chapters of the Jewish history of the community and its members. So commemorating the Jewish history and the victims of the Shoah means keeping alive Jewish heritage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk, and I'll now quickly introduce our next speaker, who is Michal Frankl. He is the head of the Shoah History Department in the Jewish Museum in Prague, and his research areas include modern anti-Semitism, refugee policy, and the Holocaust. He's the author of numerous articles and books. Very well known is the Theresienstädter Gedenkbücher, the memorial books of Theresienstadt, and his book on the Czech anti-Semitism at the end of the 19th century, I think this was the dissertation, obtained very positive reviews and was called a pioneer work of research on anti-Semitism in the Bohemian countries. Michal Frankl is going to give a paper on reconstructing the archive of Theresienstadt Ghetto. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for inviting me here. After the Terezín Ghetto has been liberated at the beginning of May 1945, Benjamin Murmelstein, the powerful, if not all-powerful, Judenältester Jewish elder in Terezín, has resigned, and he found himself a new occupation, at least for a couple of weeks, and that was writing of a manuscript which he called Geschichtlicher Überblick, a historical overview, in which he was, on the one hand, trying to fill in the vacuum left by the destruction of a large part of the internal paperwork of the Terezín Jewish self-administration, but on the other hand, apparently in a way which is not dissimilar to other documentation initiatives of the time, Murmelstein was trying to influence the view of Terezín history in a way which suited him. Murmelstein's historical account, this one, was never published. However, it became accessible in different versions in several archival collections around the world. And this leads me to the very subject of my talk, namely the way how the archival collections that related to the Terezín or Theresienstadt Ghetto were created and constructed. I believed it was a good idea here in Vienna it was appropriate to have Benjamin Murmelstein accompany me, especially because I have no powerful PowerPoint to help me. What you can see over there is just basically an advertisement that the archival collection Terezín at the Jewish Museum in Prague has been digitized and is fully accessible online with the kind support of the Claims Conference. Now, let me say a couple of words at the beginning about what I want to achieve in my paper today. I have a twofold agenda. One is to look in some more detail into the process of construction and reconstruction of archival collections that document Theresienstadt. I could almost say that in reference to the title of the conference, I could almost say this could be a little subversive, since I would claim that this is not a historical heritage which was simply recovered, but apparently it was these collections were constructed in some ways, and I want to go into some detail about how these collections were influenced by this process. The other agenda is to say a few words about the European Holocaust research infrastructure and a sub-project which is devoted to Terezín archival collections. I must admit that I'm here in twofold position as well. On the one hand, as a historian who tries to critically analyze the development of archival collections, on the other hand, as somebody who's deeply involved in constructing them himself, so that you have to bear with me. Apparently, it's going to result in a number of contradictions. Now, to introduce the subject, I think we will probably all agree that archival collections are a result of constructions, conscious constructions, and I think I need to explain this a little bit. I need to explain why this is important for Holocaust collections in Jewish archives. Well, this is a little daring from my part, since I'm, especially in presence of many professional archivists, since I'm not a professional archivist and I've never studied archival science, and I certainly welcome your comments. Well, indeed, most fonts or collections that are housed in an archive and are made public to researchers are in some way constructed at the beginning by the initial selection of files. Many files are discarded in the process of archiving, by the archival arrangement, by the structure and the quality of archival descriptions or the finding aids. Apparently, an archivist is no passive agent who would only mechanically take over collections and make sure that they physically survive. But on the other hand, most collections coming to regular archives have much clearer structure and content and are more or less closed by the time of being transferred there. Let's say a collection of a ministry of something interior requires much less reordering, much less creative development, even though it requires a lot of work, such as partial reordering, discarding, finding aids, etc., etc. In the same way, many personal archives or papers or Nachlässe are often handed over to an archive after the creator has passed away. The archive tends to be in one location, sometimes pre-organized, etc., etc. But Holocaust collections in Jewish archives are usually a very different story. Many of these collections have been created only by the initiative of prisoners during the war or after the liberation. Many are an attempt to proactively create archives in the absence of reliable documentation from ghettos or camps, or basically the perception of a lack of the existence of reliable documentation. And apparently, to highlight the difference, which is it's quite self-evident, but in regular archives, you only very often find that the archivist has such a direct connection to the subject that is just being archived, as this is in Jewish archives and in Holocaust Jewish archives. So I'd like to start now by saying a few words about documentation projects related to Terezín, but before I do it, even though it's probably not necessary, let me say a couple of words about the ghetto in Terezín, or Theresienstadt in German, which was one of the major places of suffering and death of Jews, not only from Bohemian lands or Czech lands, but also from other European countries, including Germany and Austria. Out of approximately 150,000 prisoners, over 30,000 died there due to starvation, overcrowded and unhygienic accommodation due to diseases, etc., etc. Another 90,000 were deported to ghettos and extermination camps in the east, and only roughly 4,000 of them returned. Unlike most other ghettos in Nazi-occupied East Central Europe, Terezín wasn't liquidated, closed down by the end of the war, and a fraction of its prisoners survived inside the ghetto walls and was eventually liberated. And apparently, needless to say, Terezín is very well known for its role in the Nazi propaganda and also because of the rather rich cultural life of its prisoners. Now, the Terezín Jewish Council, called Council of Elders, with its very extensive structure and multifaceted agenda, the self-administration produced a large number of documents, the lack of paper in the ghetto notwithstanding. However, most of these documents have been destroyed towards the end of the war on the orders of the SS commander of the ghetto. Karel Lágus and Josef Polák describe in their book about Terezín, published in 1960s in Czech, they describe how all materials that related to the pre-1945 period were taken away, and that the search for dangerous documents extended not only to the offices of the Jewish self-administration, but also to the lodgings of prisoners, especially lists and card files of murdered people, and those who were deported to the ghettos and extermination camps in the East were confiscated, as was the physical evidence of Terezín mortality, which was the ashes of people who deceased in Terezín, ashes that were being kept in a so-called columbarium in the walls of the Terezín fortress. And the ashes have been partly dispersed in the Ohře, Eger river, and partly buried outside of Terezín. Therefore, the surviving original documentation that is there about Terezín was either actively used and created after January 1, 1945, for instance, a card file of prisoners who mostly survived in the ghetto, or it was documentation that was kept illegally by various groups of prisoners, or it was recreated after the liberation. Now, already during the existence of the ghetto, we know this is something which is not very well researched, and what I'm going to tell you is more kind of attempt to provide an overview rather than an in-depth study. We know about several initiatives by Terezín prisoners to hide and safeguard documents, but in comparison, for instance, to Warsaw or Lodz or many other places, all these attempts are really much less known. Some of the documents in the central registry or their copies, among them the transport lists, were hidden and survived the evacuation of these documents. And for instance, Hermann Weiss, who was the head of the central registry, describes how he and his colleagues in the registry have been busy hiding these, first of all, copying these documents and hiding them in order that they're not discovered. And Karl Hermann, or Hermann in Czech, created, for instance, an extensive documentation about the cultural life in the ghetto, including posters, programs, poems, etc., etc., documentation which is eventually housed in the archive of the Terezín Memorial. A.G. Adler, one of the future historians of the ghetto, is also known to have collected material and insights already during his stays in the ghetto. However, the most extensive set of documents was put together by the Hechaluts, by a group around Zevšek, and it was transported to Prague after liberation by Šek's friend Aliza Erman, and while Šek was deported to Auschwitz, and he eventually survived in Dachau. Aliza Šek told me sometime before she passed away how she had to transport 2 really heavy suitcases full of paper and other material from Terezín to Prague instead of her other personal belongings. So we can just think about what if she would decide to save the personal belongings, the clothes, and not the paper, but it's just on the margins. I'm just I don't want to talk in detail about the cultural life in Terezín and the Terezín film, so that I would just remark that one of the problems of Terezín archives and Terezín documentation is a comparative lack of visual material, by which I mean photo material, and I want to make the case for using the two Terezín propaganda films with, and the photos that were made in conjunction with them with utmost caution. And there's very few, the authentic photo material is very limited. There's, for instance, a series taken secretly by a Czech gendarme, or a rather extensive set of photos made after liberation. But apart from this, compared, for instance, to Warsaw, there's really few photo documentation. Immediately after liberation, a group around Zev Šek started the so-called Dokumentační akce, or documentation project, which was a Czech and later also Slovak version of the Jewish historical commissions that we know from Poland, from DP camps, and from other places. Within a very short period, which is roughly half a year, or a little bit more than half a year, between liberation and making Aliyah, the group feverishly collected documents, photos, artwork, and testimonies documenting the persecution of Jews from Bohemian lands. In 1946, after Šek moved to Palestine, the collection was divided. The larger part was sent to Palestine, and a smaller part was placed with the Jewish Museum in Prague. And they had a kind of not a totally clear agreement about how to divide the material, and I think the agreement was also not absolutely implemented, so that the key according to which the material was divided is really unclear. In principle, the Jewish Museum in Prague should hold at least copies of those documents that deal explicitly with Czechoslovakia. Now, at the beginning of 1946, or spring 1946, the larger part of the archive was sent to Palestine with the consent of the Czechoslovak Minister of Foreign Affairs, and also with the help of Czechoslovak authorities. In a clear demonstration that the documentation of the Holocaust and the Aliyah and the building of a Jewish homeland and a Jewish state, as well as its defense, went hand in glove for Šek and his colleagues. The boxes with documents also contained illegal content, which, according to Eliza Šek at least, were weapons. This is apparently in the context of Czechoslovakia supplying, a little bit later, supplying weapons to Palestine legally. At the same time, documents were collected in the Jewish Museum in Prague, where A.G. Adler worked until 1947, when he emigrated to the United Kingdom. Now, let us pause here a little bit. I was trying to give you an overview about what was there. So we know that by around 1947, 1948, we have what I would call a critical mass of documentation about the persecution of Bohemian and Moravian Jews and about Terezín in place, even though it is divided. We know also that all the important historians, early historians of Terezín, which would be A.G. Adler, Zdeněk Lederer, and then Karel Lágus and Josef Polák, to name the most important personalities, all of them were using more or less the same set of documents in slightly different combinations. But let me say a couple of words about what building of this material, of these archives actually meant. I think it is very important to analyze the creation of Jewish Holocaust Archive in the broader context of how ethnicity, or how concepts of citizenship relate to ethnicity, and how this is being expressed in the archives. I'm pretty sure, or the other way around, before the Second World War, creation of a Jewish archive of this kind, even though there was already a Jewish museum, creation of a Jewish archive of this kind would be in Czechoslovakia, with its quite liberal tradition, would be something unthinkable, and the Jewish community would not be even trying to do so. So that for the Jewish community, the very fact that it's building in the Jewish museums through the dokumentační akce, that it's building an archive of the Holocaust, this is a very sign of the undermining of the concept of equality and concept of citizenship, and a kind of uncertainty about the role of Jews as citizens in post-war Czechoslovakia. And seen now in a broader context, and at the same time the Jewish community in Prague, or Jewish communities in Czechoslovakia, are documenting the names of the victims, and they eventually create one of the early places, authentic places of memory, which is the memorial in the Pinkas Synagogue in Prague. And they also are trying to establish their own memorial days, which would be the 8th of March for the memory of the Terezín family camp in Auschwitz-Birkenau. So that we can see the archive also as a symbolical lieu de mémoire, place of memory, in conjunction with this. On the other hand, the state seems not to be interested in this kind of documentation, but it is interested in certain documents. And I think it's interested only in documents that serve to registration of population which could be used to repatriation, so that the state eventually takes over, if not even confiscates, records that became part or were part of the birth and death records. For instance, quite an extensive set of death records, death certificates from Theresienstadt. It also takes over a large part of the various card files and lists, transport lists, card files from Terezín, etc., etc. The second comment which I want to make here is apparently we can see already at this moment that the historians of the ghetto are Adler, Lagus Polák, and others are in some ways constructing the archives that they're then using to write their histories, or the other way around. All of them are survivors of the ghetto, and they apparently have a large influence about how Terezín archives look like. Now, a couple of comments about what happened to the material later on. Terezín is a typical example of the fragmentation of archival resources. I'll now skip the details about the story of it, but today, because I don't think we do have time for that, but today the Czech collection is, the Czech Theresienstadt collection is located in Yad Vashem, and other documents are located in Beit Theresienstadt in Israel. Apparently there's the collection in the Jewish Museum in Prague, which you can see over there. And there is a very important set of documents, or important archive in Theresienstadt, in the Terezín Memorial. Next to many other archives, USHMM, YIVO, the NIOT, etc., etc. I'm not going to name all of them. Now, the other major question which I want to address is, has the character of the documentation projects and the engagement of the many activists actually shaped the contents of the Terezín collections? Well, the question isn't so easy to answer, even though I'll try in the following to provide some hints. I need to say, well, actually, even though we know a lot about the history of Terezín, we do not know very much about the history of Terezín collections. And it's interesting that I think historians are actually tend to use these collections as something given, and they actually lack resources to critically analyze them and to think critically about what might be missing. Now, apparently, the archives, to a certain degree, house what has been left, what has survived. That is clear, and there's a large degree of randomness. And for instance, we do have many more receipts for coal, for buying coal in Theresienstadt rather than personal testimonies. And nobody would select this to be this way. On the other hand, we also know that the selection of documents has already started in the ghetto by Zevšek and other activists. So this is no natural collection, or these are no natural collections with given structure and given set of documents, even though they might look like ones. So I've basically 2 points to make here. The one which is rather interesting about the Terezín collections, especially the documents that have been included already in the early period, say before 1970s, and that is that there are relatively few testimonies there, although the Dokumentační akce has been recording testimonies and basically kind of protocols, and that there's much focus on providing objective account through documents, through official documents, an objective account of Terezín history, rather to something subjective. This only changes, say, starting with 1970s, when increasing number of personal and more subjective testimonies are being acquired, and later on in 1990s, especially with the various oral history projects, which is not a topic for my talk today. Those testimonies that have been included are usually at the beginning relate to say to the larger history of the ghetto and of the Jewish Council, and to the important personalities, or they are written about by the important personalities. So there are memoirs of Karl Levenstein or documents about the death of Paul Epstein, the second Judenälteste in Theresienstadt. The second thing, and this is interconnected, the second issue is that it seems that unlike with some other archives, the Terezín archives, especially in Jewish Museum in Yad Vashem, were influenced not only by the fact that there was a limited availability of the official material of the Council of Elders, but also by the fact that the Jewish self-administration from Terezín was much less contested by survivors than it was the case with other ghettos. I could include here the example of Benjamin Murmelstein again, who was actually, having written his historical overview, he was imprisoned and investigated in Czechoslovakia. However, after several months in prison, he was eventually released, and apparently a lot of former prisoners were testifying to his favor. And I think this is quite different from how, say, the history of Warsaw Ghetto has been perceived. But apparently the Jewish self-administration in Theresienstadt also had its critics. Among the most outspoken was A.G. Adler, who, well, while not being consistent about this, considered the Council of Elders a kind of monstrous copy of a pyramid of power within a totalitarian state, a place in which personal freedom is missing and power of independent judgment is rather exceptional. However, all other Terezín historians, as critical as there might be, they have much milder view, a much more positive view of the Terezín Ältestenrat. And most of these historians have also been in some ways involved in the activities of the Jewish self-administration in Terezín. So I would argue here, and this is a hypothesis, or if you want, a speculation, but I would actually argue that there might be more reasons why personal testimonies were less important for dokumentační akce. One of them would be apparently that Zevšek and his colleagues had simply no idea about what Jivo was doing in Poland or in Eastern Europe generally. They had no idea about Chicago School or questionnaires. I'm pretty sure about that. But the other reason probably was that they had no motivation to mobilize the voices of survivors, say by actively seeking their testimonies in larger numbers. They had no motivation to do this in order to challenge the official Jewish leadership of the ghetto. On the other hand, we could argue that A.G. Adler, who wants to stylicize himself as a kind of anthropologist who observes the social life in Theresienstadt, it's more stylization than reality, I guess, but that's how he wants to be seen. He actually was much keener to collect personal testimonies. And if you look at the collection that he has put together and which is today available at the NIOT in Amsterdam, he probably himself has more testimonies there than the whole dokumentační akce has actually collected. And later on, we know that Adler, when he was living in 1950s in London, that he was working for the Wiener Library and interviewing people. So in a speculative way, I would actually say that in both ways, Adler opposing more than the others the Jewish Council, although he was also obsessed with it and has a lot of documentation about it, and also being an anthropologist, a self-declared anthropologist, this all contributed towards him having more testimonies in his own collection. Now, there's a lot of unclear, and it's difficult to clearly describe why and what has been collected and included in the Terezín collections in the Jewish Museum in Yad Vashem and in the others. But I think it is clear that these collections were very actively shaped and constructed by survivors, and we could say documentarists, who found it extremely important to safeguard the heritage of the Holocaust. And I guess we need more research into how all this happened. Can I say 2 minutes? No? No? Well, my last comment is comment on behalf of the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, which is a large international project mentioned here already, that we are currently engaged in a project that tries to virtually combine the major 4 Theresienstadt collections or archives, Jewish Museum, Yad Vashem, Beit Theresienstadt, Terezín Memorial, and some others, in order that we overcome this fragmentation of Terezín-related resources, and we believe that with the help of modern digital humanities techniques that we will be able to build a new tool for researchers, a tool which not only points them to the right archive, but also provides new ways about how archivists can think about their own profession, especially in the way that the so-called Terezín Research Guide or Theresienstadt Research Guide, which will be in about 1.5 years available online, that this guide will differ from the conventional finding aids or archival descriptions in the way that it will allow researchers to look at the material from different perspectives. It will not lock them into one particular narrative, such as the narrative of the Jewish Council, which is important, but it will try to provide, basically take care for a plurality of views. And we also hope that eventually it might help for Theresienstadt to receive a new major historical study, since many people say since A.G. Adler's book was published in 1950s, we are waiting for a really important study about Theresienstadt, which would be grounded in current research into the Holocaust.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there are lots of questions and comments.
My question goes to Michal. It was a very short remark, and I'm not sure whether I understood you correctly, and that's the reason I'm asking, is you pointed out that this kind of Jewish archive with its idea, building up a Jewish identity and so on, wouldn't have been possible in the first Czechoslovak Republic, because the concept of ethnicity and the concept of citizenship of the First Republic and the Third Republic differs. And I'm not sure whether I understood you correctly. That's the reason I'm asking for if you could elaborate them. But I think I understood you correctly and I disagree, but this is the reason I ask.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm fully aware that this was very compressed and might not be easy to understand. I'm persuaded that it's important to take into account that the post-war Czechoslovakia is not the liberal state or quasi-liberal state that we know from the years 1918 to 1938, and that it certainly stood in the shadow of the Munich Agreement. And what I would think is not only a wave of nationalism and anti-Semitism, but a profound shift in the way how citizenship is being constructed and understood. We see that after the Munich Agreement of 1938, in Czechoslovakia, there is a strong tendency to bind citizenship to ethnicity. So, for instance, by excluding Jews or certain groups of Jews from citizenship, that would be a long story which probably doesn't belong into this conference. But we also know that post-war Czechoslovakia was after the Holocaust and in the context of expelling local Germans, it's a society which is under transformation ethnically, and it's increasingly a society which understands itself as a culturally, ethnically homogeneous one. And it was eventually, and I think this persists still today to a certain degree, and many people tend to understand the Czech Republic as Czech, and this idea is more, I think, in the minds than on the ground, but it's very strong. We also know that the position of minorities generally has been problematized from the point of view of belonging to the state, and it has been problematized already during the wartime in the different concepts that were voiced inside of occupied Czechoslovakia or in the exile, for instance, in London when Beneš, the President Beneš and his associates speculate about how to prevent another Munich Agreement, which in their eyes was caused by the very existence of a minority. So I would argue, and I think archives have something to do with national history, especially state or government-sponsored archives. And therefore, I would argue from the point of view of the government archives, there's a kind of filter about what is relevant for being kept, for being archived, or for instance at this time for being collected to be presented at the Nuremberg trials. And I would also argue, acknowledging that more research is needed, but I would argue that large part of the material that is Holocaust related and that we find very important was not very appreciated from this point of view.
My question is directed to Susanne Uslu, first speech. I wanted to know, I know it's not your personal decision, but I would like to know what are the reasons for the very strict handling of personal data, the restrictions of personal data in using the archive, because it's much stricter than it's handled in other public archives, and even much stricter than it's handled in Jerusalem in the Central Archives. I think it's a problem for research and for...
Yes,
yeah, I think so.
I understand your question very well. So I had a discussion yesterday about data protection, and the regulations are not made by the Jewish community, they were made by the Austrian Republic. So I don't know which records you want to look at, and you did not get the information. So for my part, I try, or the archive or the community tries to support every research, every request. We invite every student, every project, memory project to the archive. But you have to understand, we have to protect the individual concerns of the probably living persons. We did not check if all the persons that are in our database have already died, and there are regulations even in the archive at the city of Vienna that says a person must be born 110 years ago, or there are 50 years with the final handwriting or remark in the record. So with some personalized or with some holdings in the archive, we are very careful because we do not know, and I know it's a problem for the user and researcher. We do not know if they're still alive or if there are children still alive. And even for the immigration questionnaire, the relatives, the children, they are mentioned on the backside of the questionnaire. And so tell me please how to handle if somebody reads online or in a publication his name or the name of the parents, and he calls me and say, what do you do with my information, with my personal data? So I have to protect these regulations that were made by the Austrian public. If anybody wants to change it, they could be, how do you say, novelized or something like that. So I don't know how in Jerusalem, the Austria has a very strict data protection law. This is right. And my personal point of view is I support everybody, but it's also in the responsibility of the researcher to handle these data, not to give it away to third parties and so on. So I really, I'm a hardliner, but I always say in the beginning I am probably strict, and we can go on talking about everything. I mean I am not strict. I don't say no. You're not allowed to have an insight in any record, but there are data protection. Can you tell me one example?
Yeah. No, but the example the files or the document we've seen before. It was I think that was the questionnaire of the social department of Jewish community, and it's a document I think from Jerusalem. And as far as I've seen, maybe it was a person born in the 1880s or 90s. Yeah, not so. If you're talking about the Austrian law, it's about this 110 years. You have to prove that the person is dead at least 110 years. So this is stricter, in my opinion. You understand what I mean? And I think it's very difficult in praxis if you, for example, if you write about Aryanizations or something, if you're not allowed to. I mean, I understand it concerning people who are still alive or maybe are still alive, but
you have to imagine there are still people living who do not want to get postal letters from the community with the header on it because they fear that the neighbors realize that they are members of the Jewish community.
Only want to remind, it was a very short presentation of Susanne Uslu, that in 2007, I think, there was a big exhibition in the Jewish Museum. The Sammlungsleiterin of the Jewish Museum, Dr. Kohlbauer, is here, and there was a very impressive catalogue, and it was an exhibition about also the pre-war holdings. And for people who like archives, you can see, you should read this catalogue, which the title is Ordnung muss sein.
Thank you for this comment.
Professor Rosen and then Professor Kassow. But he was, okay. Professor Rosen was first and then Professor Kassow.
Thanks very much to both speakers. For the second speaker on Terezín, thanks. I have a remark and a question. The remark has to do with constructed and constructing, which is borrowed from postmodern criticism, and to my mind, as a suggestion, it may be useful to take what we've heard here about archives to challenge the concept of constructing and constructed, rather than simply as a reflex bringing it over. Because constructed has to do, usually taken from a text or a literary text with a single author, which I think has problems anyway. And certainly with the archives, we're talking about a very different phenomenon. So for myself, I become less rather than more convinced the more you emphasize constructed and constructing. So that's the remark. The question is, my understanding is Terezín had allowed for a religious observance and religious culture, Jewish culture, in a way that was greater than most any, certainly camp, and most ghettos. And I wonder how that facet of Terezín has affected the development of archives of this particular site. Thanks.
Thank you very much for both the remark and the question. Regarding the remark, I do agree. I've started from a different perspective, which is I was trying to provide a critical view of the more static understanding of an archive. And if I find a better expression, better term to describe this process, I'll be happy to drop the term constructing, construction. And I absolutely understand your concerns, and I share them. The question is, I'm not sure that Terezín that the Terezín ghetto was much better or much freer in terms of religious observance than the other ghettos. I'm not sure if I'm able to provide a comparative perspective. You certainly are right that there was a certain possibility for religious life there. Also non-Jewish religious life, since there were a lot of Christian converts, Catholic or Protestant, in the ghetto. However, I think it has almost no relationship whatsoever to the archives. And actually, let me just reverse it. There was a colleague of mine who recently was trying to write her MA thesis and later on a PhD thesis about Jewish religious life in Theresienstadt. And she, including, for instance, weddings, etc., etc. And I think she had a very, very hard time to find enough evidence. So what we have, perhaps some colleagues can correct me, but what we mostly have are documents that relate to deaths in the ghetto, which apparently was linked also to religious practices. But I think in terms of Terezín archives, and this is not very significant, and I would actually argue that those who were shaping the archives, to avoid the word creating them, those were people who were not very observant, and they certainly, and they were rather acculturated, integrated, or if you want, assimilated Jews living in Bohemian lands, and observance was not very significant to them.
Yeah, this is a question about the Vienna archives. I'm just curious. I don't know much about this, but could you comment more on this attempt to get archives back from Israel? What that showed about the community here? Were there any surprises? In terms of the legal issues, who has the legal standing to ask for those archives? Is it the Austrian government? Is it the city? Is it the community? Is it the archive? Were you surprised by anything that you observed during this whole process?
So there's three questions actually you asked. The first is the ownership or the producer. The community of the Jewish community of Vienna, they produced the documents. They are the author. They have the copyright, and this is why we at one moment we want the documents back. The other thing is that with the rediscovery in 2000, we have an overall plan to reconstruct the archive, not even for the holdings in Jerusalem, but also for Moscow and for other, probably, we do not know even where, in which countries, holdings from Vienna are stored. If we do await surprises, yes, because we do not even know our own documents. Most of the documents that are microfilmed are from 1933 to 1945, and there are just a few exceptions concerning Jewish organizations and associations. But we do not know our own archival documents from before 1933. We always have to ask for microfilms or for digitals concerning, let's say, the main synagogue or the founding of the community. The microfilms are in black-white. They are sometimes in good quality. Mostly they are in a very bad quality. There is no authenticity, or how do you say? You cannot read the signature. You do not know microfilm things, if they are original, if they are copies. They might be not. So we await a lot of surprises because we see our own archival documents for the first time when, whatever, or if we get them back. So this, we are hopeful, but I think everybody in the room knows that it's very, very difficult.
Were there many people in the community who opposed this attempt to reclaim documents from Israel?
There is a decision by the board of the Jewish community to rebuild the archive and to get back all the archival documents from Russia, from Israel, Jerusalem, and from Poland, and from any other country we detect or we find documents. There is a decision by the board.
Thank you very much. I think we can close the discussion. We are going to have a coffee break, and we are going to meet in half an hour back here. Thank you very much for your talks.